If you're approaching, or indeed are even past your 75th birthday, then firstly I have no idea how you got here, but nonetheless I hope you're comfortably retired and are spending your days sat on a rocking chair in front of the fire, telling your grandchildren stories about the good old days. Before social media, before the boo-boos or something, I don't know. The point is, I hope you're enjoying living life in the slow lane. And if you're my age, well, we're just hoping that the world isn't on fire by then, let alone the prospect of having a pension. All that to say, when it was time for Jaguar to celebrate their 75th birthday, they decided to, well, not do any of that. They didn't rest on their laurels or shamelessly just throw back to the past, but nor were they bound by the uncertain future that currently lies ahead of them. No, they decided to celebrate in style with this, the CX-75 concept. The plucky Brit that could have been the fourth member of what would become known as the hypercar Holy Trinity. Trouble is though, when it comes to those plucky Brits, that title is either patently false or doesn't end up going too well. And regrettably, the CX-75 falls into the latter of those two categories, because of course it didn't make production. But that's not to say that it went down without a fight. Revealed at the 2010 Paris Motor Show, the CX-75 concept was met with basically unanimous love and admiration based on its looks alone, but the car was more than just a pretty arse. Under the skin, the proposed technology behind this Jaguar supercar made the members of the Holy Trinity look unambitious in comparison. While all were hybrids, Jaguar took a completely different approach, with 4 inboard electric motors, each powering a wheel apiece, and to charge the batteries, 2 jet engines. Allow me to try and explain. Made by British company Blade & Jets, the CX-75 featured 2 micro turbines, fueled by diesel and spinning at up to 80,000 RPM to generate electricity and act as one hell of a party piece for rich people to bore their friends with. There was no arguing with the end results though, a total output of 770 horsepower and 1180 foot-pounds of torque, plus a range of over 550 miles. Except of course, there was some arguing with all of that because that stuff was purely theoretical and the real car had no turbines, a single electric motor and a top speed of about 4. In the end, Jaguar abandoned the turbine idea, but they weren't about to compromise on their overall performance goals for the CX-75. And those goals were pretty lofty. The car had to be as quick to 100 miles an hour as a Bugatti Veyron, had to have 40 miles of all-electric range, and all the while could produce no more emissions than a Toyota Prius. So in order to achieve that, Jaguar got in contact with Williams Advanced Engineering, an offshoot of the Formula 1 team, and went with a more conventional plug-in hybrid setup, utilising an internal combustion engine in conjunction with electric motors. The performance and environmental goals set by Jaguar weren't the only constraints either, as in order to preserve the car's elegant shape, that engine had to be extremely compact. The end result was a 1.6 litre turbo and supercharged 4-cylinder that produced 502 horsepower all on its own. That meant 313 horsepower per litre, or about twice as much specific output as any other car on the market at the time. With the pair of electric motors accounted for, total power sat at 850 horsepower and 738 foot-pounds of torque. And this time, the numbers really didn't lie. With the car's 4-wheel drive and 7-speed single-clutch gearbox, 0 to 60 miles an hour took 2.9 seconds, 0 to 100 took 5.5, and the top speed was 220. Oh, and on the official EU test cycle, it matched the 89 grams per kilometre CO2 output of a Prius. And while that is all very impressive, you may be worried about the sound. After all, it's not an exotic V8 or V12 like the car's would-be rivals. But worry not, because that 1.6 litre four-banger was the result of an abandoned F1 project, revved beyond 10,000 RPM, and sounded like this. This time, Jaguar were serious about building the thing. In May of 2011, it was announced that a limited production run of 250 cars would commence, running from 2013 through to 2015, using that hybrid setup and meaning it would have been launched right into the thick of it with Porsche, Ferrari and McLaren. And it was priced to compete too, with a projected price tag of about £800,000. 5 development prototypes were created, but that is, sort of, as far as things went. In late 2012, Jaguar made the difficult decision to cancel the project, thanks to the global financial situation going down the shitter. Unlike the case of the Chrysler ME412, the CX-75 was not a victim of callous corporate meddling. In fact, the project had huge support from Jaguar's Indian owners at Tata, but unfortunately it was just not deemed financially feasible. That, and perhaps Jaguar fearing another XJ220 situation, but I'll speak more about that at the end of the video. For now, let's go back to those 5 development prototypes, because this is the bit where we have to start keeping track of what happened to these cars. Jaguar kept the cars around and persisted testing at their facility in Gaydon in the name of R&D, even letting the press drive these basically finished cars to give us a taste of what would never be. There are plenty of reviews out there on the internet, but the general consensus was that the CX-75 would have been a match for the Holy Trinity, but with a character all of its own. It was a proper Jag. Sure, it didn't have space for golf clubs, but it had both grace and pace by the bucket load. Unfortunately, one of the CX-75 prototypes was involved in what has been described as a thermal incident. Translation, it caught fire. But rather fittingly, 2 more of those prototypes were repainted in orange for the next chapter of the car's life. That is, of course, its role as the villain car in the James Bond film Spyder. Now, naturally, these prototypes were too valuable and delicate for any of the more stunty stuff, so they were only used for low speed and static shots. However, Jaguar got in contact once again with Williams Advanced Engineering, where they created 5 custom stunt cars just for the film. These cars looked identical to the prototypes, but were completely tailor-made for Spyder, with Jaguar Land Rover's 542 horsepower supercharged V8, a tubular space frame chassis, and rally spec suspension. The latter of those features doubtless coming in pretty handy when the car was launched down 70 of Rome's concrete steps for the chase scenes. What's more, the traction control and ABS were removed, but a hydraulic handbrake was fitted to aid with those gratuitous drifting scenes. Oh, and the gearbox was nicked from the McLaren 650S GT3 car. And it must be said, it was a pretty good chase scene. Of course I'd love to show you, but MGM would probably put a hit out on my entire family. Anyway, after filming had concluded for the film, the surviving cars were auctioned off, with the proviso that they couldn't be driven on the public road. Now that was fair enough, as the cars were pretty raw and specialised. Plus, anyone willing to part with that much money would likely be treating that car as an investment, locking it away in a garage never to see the light of day again. That was, except for one of those people. Because, in 2024, one of the 4 surviving stunt cars was sent to a man called Callum. Ian Callum. And his company, Callum. This was the man who was in charge of Jaguar's design department when the CX-75 was first created, but had since moved on to pastures new with his own company. Seriously though, man's got one hell of a CV, being fully or partially responsible for designs like the Aston Martin DB7, DB9, Vanquish, V8 Vantage, the Jaguar XK, XJ and F-Type, as well as more obscure cars like the Ford RS200 and Nissan R390. Anyway, I've got sidetracked there. Once reunited with his creation, Callum and his company got to work on Stunt car chassis number 7, with one goal: to make it road legal, which as it happens is not as easy as you might first think, especially when the customer wanted to keep the car as close to the stunt vehicle as possible while still gaining approval for it to be driven on the public road. The car was pretty beaten up, so some of the carbon fibre body panels needed replacing, the panel gaps needed sorting out, and the interior needed to be made slightly less lethal, what with all the exposed bolts and wires that previously littered the cabin. Naturally, being a stunt car, it drove pretty well, but it did have an appetite for clutches, which had to be addressed, although the GT3 spec sequential gearbox was retained. A larger fuel tank was fitted so you could get off the end of your driveway before having to fill up again, as well as myriad other smaller changes to make the car roadworthy, including a slightly less antisocial exhaust for emissions purposes, and the power steering system from a Citroën C1 of all things. Nonetheless, the project was a success, and the car can be seen on YouTube hurtling around the Top Gear test track at the hands of the stick. But that isn't quite the end. Such was the quality of the work that Callum did on that car that they got another customer, this time the owner of stunt vehicle chassis number 1. And their requirements were very different to that of the first customer who wanted to keep the stunt car spirit alive. This example had to not just be road legal, but be a proper daily drivable car. The racing gearbox was replaced with a 7-speed dual clutch unit, the interior was painstakingly trimmed with all the leather and metal trim that you could shake, well, quite a lot of money at. And then on the outside, the active aero was refined, there's an air brake, and of course, that gorgeous willow green paintwork. And as such, that's the closest that we'll ever get to a proper production-ready CX-75. But while the car wasn't to be in any of its original forms, and that is a shame, I sort of think that in the end, that might have been for the better. Just hear me out on this one, okay? Considering the sellout success of the Holy Trinity hypercars, Jaguar's assertion that there wasn't a business case for the CX-75 can ring a little hollow, but we have to remember that Jaguar was arguably pushing the hybrid technology much further than its rivals, and B, well, our Jaguar, so it was likely to break. I mean, even nowadays, 10 years later, we see how Mercedes are struggling with the AMG 1 that had a similar engine configuration to the original CX-75 prototype. But also, there's the narrative aspect to all of this, and traditions. Because Jaguar hasn't exactly had the best form when it comes to these types of vehicles. There was the stillborn XJ13 Le Mans racer in the 60s, then there's the XJR15, which raced only thrice, and my abiding memory of is Jeremy Clarkson's spinning one on the VHS tape I had as a kid. And of course, there was also the XJ220. Now that car did make production, but could hardly be qualified as a success. Like the CX-75, the XJ220's technical makeup changed dramatically from its initial conception. It was famously supposed to have had a V12 and 4-wheel drive, and of course ended up with half the amount of cylinders and half the amount of driven wheels. Indeed, unsold XJ220 sat rotting on dealer lots for years, and it's only decades later that people have really started to appreciate the car for what it is. And I guess that's what I'm trying to say here. You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. Wait a minute, the CX-75 did become the villain. Well, in that case, I've just wasted your time. Thanks for watching.